Brandon's laugh cut through Precision Armory like a knife through butter, making every single person in the store turn to look. Margaret Sullivan stood near the ammunition counter, her gray hair pulled back in a simple clip, both hands shaking so badly that the tremor was visible from across the room. She wore a comfortable cardigan over a plain blouse, sensible slacks, and walking shoes that had seen better days. Nothing about her screamed danger or expertise. Everything about her whispered ordinary grandmother out on errands. "Ma'am, I think you're looking for the craft store," Brandon announced loudly enough for the entire store to hear. He was 27 years old with perfectly styled hair that probably took him an hour every morning, and a smile that suggested he'd never been told no in his entire life. "That's 2 blocks down on Maple Street. They sell yarn and stuff for people who, can actually hold things steady." He gestured dramatically at Margaret's trembling hands like a game show host pointing out a prize. The comparison wasn't kind, and it wasn't meant to be. A man browsing expensive hunting rifles nearby laughed so hard he nearly dropped his phone. He wore a tailored jacket that probably cost more than Margaret's entire outfit, designer boots that had never seen actual dirt, and sunglasses pushed up on his head even though they were indoors. "Dude, someone needs to call her caretaker." She definitely wandered away from somewhere. The store filled with laughter that felt like broken glass. 35 people, maybe 40, all focused on one woman who looked like she didn't belong. Margaret's steel blue eyes took it all in without blinking, without reacting, without giving them the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. Precision Armory was the kind of place that intimidated regular people. Glass cases full of weapons that cost more than used cars. Ammunition displays organized with military precision. Staff wearing tactical gear like they were about to deploy to a war zone instead of working retail. The floors were so polished you could see your reflection, and everything smelled like gun oil and expensive cologne. Brandon stepped closer, his boots making sharp sounds on the tile floor. "Seriously, Grandma, this isn't a pharmacy. We don't sell medication here. We sell ammunition. The things that go in guns." He spoke slowly and loudly, the way some people talk to anyone over 50, like age automatically meant deaf and stupid. Margaret set down her small leather purse on the counter with careful movements. Her hands shook the entire time, never stopping, never steady, but somehow she managed to place the purse exactly where she wanted it. She straightened up, and something about the way she moved made Thomas Harrison pause in his browsing. Thomas was in his late 50s, a retired Army Ranger who still carried himself like he was ready for inspection. He'd been looking at rifle scopes near the back wall, minding his own business, trying to decide between 2 models. But something about Margaret's posture caught his attention and wouldn't let go. Her feet had shifted, just slightly, barely noticeable unless he knew what to look for. Shoulder width apart, knees bent just a fraction, weight balanced perfectly between both legs. It was the kind of stance that got drilled into soldiers until they did it without thinking, the foundation of everything from hand-to-hand combat to precision shooting. Thomas's hand froze on the scope he'd been examining. That stance wasn't something you learned from YouTube videos or weekend self-defense classes at the community center. That was professional training, the kind that came from doing something thousands of times until your body remembered it even when your brain was busy with other things. Brandon was still talking, enjoying his audience, feeding off their laughter like it was applause. "You know what I think? I think someone's having a senior moment. Maybe we should call an ambulance instead of security. Get you checked out, make sure you know what day it is, where you live, basic stuff like that." The crowd ate it up. Phones came out of pockets everywhere, screens lighting up as people started recording. This was going to be great content. Confused elderly woman in gun store, probably thinking it was a grocery store or something. The videos would be all over social media within minutes. A woman in designer jeans and a fur-trimmed vest that probably cost a month's rent pushed forward through the crowd. Her makeup was perfect, her blonde hair styled in complicated waves. Her nails painted a color that had some fancy name like Desert Sunrise or Autumn Whisper. She pulled out her phone and started a live stream right there, narrating for her followers. "Okay, guys, you're not going to believe what I'm seeing right now," she said in her camera, her voice dripping with that particular brand of fake concern that was really just cruelty wearing a mask. There's this elderly woman in a gun store, and she's clearly lost or confused or something. Her hands are shaking so bad, like really bad, and she thinks she can buy ammunition. It's honestly kind of sad. Her followers responded immediately. Comments started scrolling across her screen so fast she could barely read them. Most were laughing along with her. A few suggested she should help the poor, confused old lady. Nobody suggested that maybe the old lady knew exactly what she was doing. Margaret stood quietly through all of it, her hands continuing their constant tremor, her face calm as a still pond. She'd been through worse than mockery from strangers. Much worse. The kind of worse that left scars you couldn't see but never stopped feeling. Brandon leaned against the ammunition counter like he owned it, like he owned the whole world, really. He crossed his arms over his chest, showing off muscles he'd probably built at an expensive gym while staring at himself in floor-to-ceiling mirrors. Let me save everyone some time here. Ma'am, this is a specialized store for people who actually know about firearms and ammunition. We're not trying to be mean or anything, but maybe you'd be more comfortable somewhere else? Somewhere more appropriate for someone in your, condition. He said condition like it was a disease, something catching, something to be avoided. The man in the expensive hunting jacket decided to add his 2 cents. My grandmother has that shaking thing too. Parkinson's, right? She can barely use a TV remote anymore. There's no way this lady can handle anything in here without hurting herself or someone else. More laughter rippled through the crowd like waves crashing on a beach, building on each other, getting louder and meaner with each repetition. But Thomas wasn't laughing. He'd moved closer, pretending to examine ammunition boxes near where Margaret stood, but really watching her with the kind of attention that had kept him alive through 2 deployments in Afghanistan and 1 in Iraq. Something wasn't adding up. The tremor in her hands was real, no question about that. But it wasn't random shaking. There was a pattern to it, a rhythm that felt familiar in a way he couldn't quite place. He'd seen tremors like that before. Guys who'd spent too much time on the .50 caliber machine guns, the big weapons that kicked hard enough to rattle your bones. After enough hours behind those weapons, some guys developed a shake they couldn't control. The doctors called it neurological damage. The guys in the units called it combat tremor. Either way, it was permanent, and it marked you as someone who'd spent serious time in serious situations. Thomas studied Margaret's hands more carefully, trying not to be obvious about it. The tremor was constant, but specific. It affected certain muscles more than others. That wasn't Parkinson's disease. That wasn't old age. That was injury, the kind you got from repeated trauma to the nerves in very specific ways. Stephen Wright had been restocking inventory in the back room when he heard Brandon's voice carrying through the store. Stephen was the assistant manager, 43 years old, former Marine Corps armorer who'd spent 6 years maintaining weapons for special operations units. He'd heard every kind of customer come through these doors. Nervous first-time buyers. Overconfident amateurs who thought playing video games made them experts. Professional shooters who actually knew what they were talking about. But something about the tone in Brandon's voice made Stephen stop what he was doing and walk toward the front. Brandon was a decent employee most of the time, but he had a mean streak that came out when he thought he had the upper hand. Stephen had talked to him about it before, warned him that disrespecting customers was a firing offense, but clearly the message hadn't stuck. Stephen emerged from the back room just in time to see Brandon gesturing mockingly at an older woman whose hands were shaking. Great. Just great. This was exactly the kind of situation that led to complaints, bad reviews, and corporate calling to ask what the hell was going on in his store. He was about to step in, about to shut Brandon down and apologize to the customer, when the woman spoke for the first time since entering the store. Federal Premium .308 Winchester, she said, and her voice cut through the noise like a hot knife through frozen butter. Not loud, not aggressive, just clear and precise and absolutely certain. 168 grain Sierra Match King hollow point boat tail. Lot number -7,843 Malawian kwaches. The store went silent. Not the gradual kind of quiet where conversations die out one by one, but instant silence, like someone had pressed a mute button on the entire world. Stephen felt his stomach drop somewhere around his knees. Those weren't the words of someone who'd wandered into the wrong store. That was military-grade match ammunition, the kind used by precision marksmen at ranges where most people couldn't even see the target. The lot number was even more specific. Ammunition came in batches, each one tested and documented, and serious shooters tracked lot numbers because consistency mattered when you were trying to hit something the size of a dinner plate from half a mile away. Brandon recovered first, his smirk returning like he'd never lost it. "Oh, nice. Grandma knows how to read. Did you memorize that from a magazine while waiting at the doctor's office?" The crowd laughed again, but it sounded thinner now, less certain, like maybe some of them were starting to wonder if they'd made a mistake. The woman in designer jeans repositioned her phone, making sure she captured this for her followers. Okay, so now she's trying to sound smart by rattling off technical terms. "This is getting weird, guys. Like really weird." Margaret's trembling hands remained at her sides, but her steel blue eyes never left Brandon's face. The powder charge weight is 44.0 grains of IMR 4064. Ballistic coefficient 0.475. Muzzle velocity 2,650 feet per second at standard temperature and pressure. Temperature stability rated from -40 to plus 120 degrees Fahrenheit. This time the silence lasted longer. Stephen Wright's hand had frozen halfway to the inventory tablet clipped to his belt. The specifications Margaret had just recited weren't from any magazine or website. Those were internal manufacturing details, the kind of information that came from extensive field testing under actual combat conditions. He'd spent 6 years as a Marine Corps armor working with special operations units, and he'd never heard a civilian rattle off that level of technical detail with such casual precision. Brandon's smirk wavered for half a second before he doubled down, his voice getting louder to cover his uncertainty. "Wow, someone's been doing their homework on Wikipedia. Very impressive. Gold star for effort." He turned to the crowd, playing to his audience. "Next thing you know, she'll tell us she's a secret agent or something." But the laughter that followed was forced, awkward, like everyone was laughing because they thought they should rather than because anything was actually funny. A tall woman in a Gucci blazer and heels that added 4 inches to her height pushed through the crowd. Everything about her screamed money and status, from her perfectly highlighted hair to the designer purse that cost more than some people made in a month. She looked Margaret up and down with the kind of expression usually reserved for something unpleasant stuck to the bottom of an expensive shoe. "Honey," she said, and the word dripped with condescension, "I appreciate that you've been watching YouTube videos or whatever, but this really isn't the place for you. There's a general store about 3 miles from here that sells simpler things. Maybe that would be more your speed? Less confusing, more age-appropriate." She smiled while she said it, the kind of smile that was supposed to look kind but really just made the insult worse. Margaret turned her attention to the ammunition display case without acknowledging the comment. Her trembling finger pointed at the glass with surprising accuracy despite the constant shaking. "Second shelf from the top. Third box from the right. That's the specific batch I need." Brandon glanced at where she was pointing and laughed, this time with genuine disbelief. "Lady, there are like 40 boxes of ammunition in that case. They all look the same. You're just pointing randomly and hoping you get lucky." But Stephen had followed Margaret's gesture, and his mouth went dry. She wasn't pointing randomly. She'd identified a specific box among dozens of nearly identical containers. The case held ammunition from multiple manufacturers, different calibers, various bullet weights and types, all organized in a system that made sense to the staff but looked like chaos to customers. Yet somehow, with hands that shook constantly, she'd pointed directly at a box of Federal Premium .308 Winchester, 168 grain Sierra Match King, without hesitation. Stephen moved closer to the case, his professional curiosity overriding his concern about the scene Brandon was causing. That particular ammunition wasn't something they advertised heavily. It was expensive, almost $200 per box of 20 rounds, and it was serious precision ammunition used by competitive long-range shooters and military marksmen. They kept in stock because occasionally they'd get a customer who knew exactly what they wanted and money wasn't an issue. Thomas Harrison had stopped pretending to browse. He stood maybe 10 feet away now, his full attention on Margaret, watching the way she held herself, the way she moved, the specific pattern of her tremor. Everything about this woman was setting off alarm bells in his head, but not the kind of alarms that said danger. The kind that said respect, recognition, the sudden understanding that he was in the presence of someone who'd walked paths he'd only heard about in hushed conversations in secure facilities. The tremor in her hands was affecting specific muscle groups, the kind of pattern you develop from gripping heavy weapons for extended periods. Thomas had a buddy who'd developed something similar after spending 3 tours as a machine gunner. The doctors had explained it as nerve damage from repeated stress and impact, the body trying to shake out trauma it couldn't quite process. For more customers pushed through the entrance, drawn by the crowd visible through the front windows. One of them, a middle-aged man with slicked-back hair and an expensive watch, immediately pulled out his phone and started recording. "What's going on?" he asked the person next to him. "Old lady thinks she knows about guns," someone answered with a snicker. "It's pretty entertaining." Brandon decided to escalate things, probably figuring he'd already committed to this performance and might as well see it through. "You know what? Sure, let's play this game. Hey, Grandma, you want to see the fancy ammunition you definitely can't afford? I'll show you." He made an elaborate show of pulling out his key ring, jangling the keys loudly enough for everyone to hear. Of course, this ammunition costs almost $200 a box. That's probably more than your entire grocery budget for a month, right? Maybe you should stick to the bargain brands at Walmart. Oh wait, Walmart probably wouldn't even let you buy ammunition with those shaking hands. Safety hazard and all. The cruelty in his voice was naked now, not even trying to hide behind jokes or fake concern. He was enjoying this, feeding off the crowd's attention, high on the power of making someone else feel small. Margaret reached into her cardigan pocket with trembling fingers. The movement was slow and careful, adapted to hands that wouldn't stay still. She pulled out something small that caught the overhead fluorescent lights and threw back a dull gleam of aged metal. It was a badge. Not a police badge or a security guard's shield, but something else entirely. Stephen's eyes locked onto it as Margaret held it up, and he felt the blood drain from his face so fast he actually got dizzy. The badge was circular, maybe 2 inches across, worn smooth from years of handling. The engraving was mostly rubbed away, but Stephen could still make out enough details to recognize what he was looking at. A rifle crossed over a target, a wreath of laurels around the edge, and at the top, letters that were still barely visible. MU. Advanced Marksmanship Unit. Stephen had spent his entire Marine Corps career around firearms and the people who used them at the highest levels. He'd met shooters from every branch of service, competed in military competitions, maintained weapons for people who'd never officially existed in any database. And he knew that badge. Everyone in the precision shooting community knew that badge, even if most of them had never seen one in person. The Advanced Marksmanship Unit wasn't something you joined by filling out an application. It wasn't something you could buy your way into with connections or family influence. It was the absolute pinnacle of military marksmanship. The people who trained Olympic shooters and counterterrorism snipers and wrote the classified manuals that everyone else studied. Getting into AMU meant you were already among the best shooters in the military. Earning instructor credentials within AMU meant you were teaching the people who taught everyone else. That badge wasn't just rare. It was legendary. Brandon hadn't noticed Stephen's reaction. He was still running his mouth, still playing to the crowd. "Oh, what's that? Your bingo card? Your senior center membership badge? Look, I'm sure it's very important to you, but we need actual ID if you want to make a purchase. And honestly, I'm not sure we can sell to someone who might not be mentally." "Brandon." Stephen's voice cut through the mockery like a gunshot. One word, sharp and absolute. Brandon turned, surprised by the tone. "What?" "I'm just trying to help this lady understand that she's in the wrong place." "Just open the case," Stephen said, and his voice carried an edge that Brandon had never heard before. "Right now. Do it." "But Mr. Wright, she can't possibly." "Open the case." Brandon's hands fumbled with his keys, his earlier confidence evaporating under Steven's glare. He unlocked the ammunition case, muttering under his breath about how this was a waste of time and everyone would see he was right. Margaret rolled up her left sleeve with trembling fingers. The movement was practiced and efficient despite the constant shaking. Her forearm revealed itself inch by inch, and the crowd pressed closer to see what she was showing them. Scars. Not the kind you got from accidents in the kitchen or falling off a bike as a kid. These were surgical scars, precise and deliberate, running in patterns along her forearm that spoke of multiple operations to repair serious damage. They intersected and overlapped like a map of trauma, each one representing hours in an operating room and months of painful recovery. Thomas saw them and felt his breath catch in his throat. He'd seen similar scars before on guys who'd been pulled out of burning vehicles or hit by shrapnel. Those weren't battle wounds from a single incident. Those were reconstructive surgery scars, the kind you accumulated when doctors spent years trying to put you back together after your body had been catastrophically damaged. But what really made Thomas's hands clench in a fist was what Margaret pulled from her purse next. A compression sleeve, but not the kind you could buy at a pharmacy for $20. This was medical equipment that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie. Carbon fiber construction, built-in pressure sensors, therapeutic compression zones that adjusted automatically. The prescription bottle that appeared briefly from her purse before disappearing back inside was labeled with medication names Thomas recognized from his time visiting wounded buddies at military hospitals. Nerve stabilization drugs, the kind that cost hundreds of dollars per dose and required prescriptions from specialized military medical facilities. Brandon was still oblivious, still riding his wave of superiority. Got arthritis pretty bad, huh? That's tough. My advice? Skip the expensive ammunition and invest in some heating pads. Maybe some of those compression gloves they sell at the drugstore. Way more useful for someone in your condition. The ammunition boxes sat on the counter between them now, Federal Premium's distinctive packaging gleaming under the lights. Margaret reached for one with both hands, and everyone watched, waiting for her to drop it or fumble with it or prove Brandon right about her inability to handle anything requiring steady hands. Her trembling fingers closed around the box. The shaking didn't stop. It never stopped, but something remarkable happened. Despite the tremor, despite the constant motion, she opened the box with fluid efficiency. Her hands seemed to know exactly what to do, moving with precision that transcended the neurological damage, trying to sabotage every motion. She extracted a single cartridge from the foam padding inside the box. The brass casing caught the light as she rotated it between her fingers, and even though her hands shook the entire time, she handled it with the casual expertise of someone who'd done this thousands of times before. This batch has inconsistent powder charges, Margaret said, her voice quiet but absolutely certain. She wasn't looking at the cartridge. Her eyes were focused somewhere past it, reading information that wasn't visible to anyone else. Manufactured during humidity fluctuations in the facility. Quality control should have caught it, but didn't. You'll see accuracy degradation beyond 800 meters. Approximately 2.3 inches of vertical stringing at 1,000 meters, possibly worse in temperature extremes. The store had gone so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning sounded loud as a jet engine. Steven's hands were shaking now too, but for entirely different reasons. He grabbed the inventory tablet from his belt with movements so jerky he nearly dropped it. His fingers flew across the screen, pulling up data files, manufacturing reports, quality control documentation that most customers didn't even know existed. The lot number Margaret had cited. Negative 7,843 Malawian kwaches. Stephen found it in the system and opened the technical specifications. His vision actually blurred for a second as he read through the testing data. She was right. Completely, absolutely, impossibly right. That specific batch had been flagged during internal testing for minor quality control issues related to manufacturing conditions. The powder charges it showed slight variations that wouldn't matter for casual shooting, but would cause exactly the kind of accuracy problems she described at extreme distances. The information was buried in technical reports that Stephen himself had barely glanced at because they seemed too detailed to matter for retail sales. This wasn't information you could find online. This wasn't something you learned from reading magazines or watching YouTube videos. This was the kind of diagnostic capability that came from firing thousands of rounds under pressure in conditions where a 2.3-inch variation at 1,000 meters meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. "Ma'am," Stephen started, his voice coming out rough and uncertain. "Where exactly did you receive your training?" Brandon interrupted before Margaret could answer, his phone now in his hand, finger hovering over the screen. "You know what? This is getting ridiculous. This is harassment, and I'm calling corporate headquarters right now. Product tampering, disturbing other customers, possibly unstable mental state. Someone needs to remove this woman before she causes a real problem." He started dialing, making a show of it, letting everyone see that he was taking action, that he was the responsible employee protecting the store from a crazy person who'd wandered in off the street. But Margaret just smiled. It wasn't a big smile, nothing dramatic or theatrical, just a small curve of her lips that held something that might have been amusement, or might have been pity, or might have been both. "Please do make that call," she said softly. Her trembling hand carefully returned the cartridge to its box, each movement controlled despite the constant shaking. "As for Director Harrison, tell him Margaret Sullivan sends her regards." The name hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. Thomas Harrison's face went white as chalk. The blood drained so fast he actually swayed on his feet and had to grab the edge of a display case to keep from falling. His mouth opened and closed twice before any sound came out, and when it did, his voice was barely a whisper. "Harrison, Director Michael Harrison from the Advanced Marksmanship Unit." He looked at Margaret like he was seeing a ghost. "But that means you can't be Sullivan." His reaction rippled through the crowd. People who had been laughing moments ago were now looking at each other with uncertainty, suddenly aware that maybe, possibly, they'd completely misunderstood what was happening. The woman with the live stream lowered her phone slightly, her confident narration trailing off into confused silence. Brandon was still holding his phone, but his finger had frozen over the dial button. Something in the room had shifted, some fundamental change in atmosphere that even he couldn't ignore. What's going on? Who's Harrison?" Stephen had gone from pale to flushed, his mind racing through implications and connections. He picked up the store's internal phone with hands that fumbled the receiver twice before he managed to hold it steady. His voice when he spoke was hushed and urgent, like he was reporting a fire or a robbery or something equally serious. "Sir, you need to come down here. Right now." "No, sir, I'm not joking. It's urgent." "Yes, she's here right now, standing at the ammunition counter. Please hurry." He hung up and looked at Margaret with an expression that mixed awe and something close to fear. Not fear of her, but fear of what might happen next. Fear the consequences already rolling toward them like a freight train with no brakes. Brandon's phone call went through. Someone at corporate headquarters answered, their voice tinny through the speaker. "Precision Armory customer service. How can I help you?" "Yeah. Hi. I need to report a serious incident." Brandon started, his voice still confident even though everything around him was shifting. "We have an elderly woman here at the store who's tampering with merchandise and harassing customers and staff. She appears to be experiencing some kind of cognitive issues, possibly dementia. The situation is escalating and we need guidance on how to handle it safely." Margaret stood quietly through his report, her hands maintaining their constant tremor, her expression calm and unbothered. She'd been through worse than this. So much worse. And she knew how this would end because she'd seen it play out before, in other places, other times when people made assumptions about who she was based on what they saw instead of what they knew. The crowd had stopped laughing entirely now. Some people were edging toward the exits, suddenly uncomfortable with being part of whatever this was turning into. Others pressed closer, sensing that something important was happening even if they didn't understand what. The woman in designer jeans had stopped her live stream, her face flushed with the first hints of awareness that maybe, just maybe, she'd made a terrible mistake. Her followers were still commenting, though, their messages taking on a different tone as people who actually knew about military marksmanship started chiming in, asking if that badge she'd briefly shown was real, wondering if this might actually be exactly what it looked like. And then the front entrance burst open with enough force to make the glass door slam against its stopper, the sound echoing through the store like thunder. Alexander Chen stood in the doorway, breathing like he'd just run a marathon. His tie was crooked, his dress shirt had come partially untucked from his pants, and sweat darkened the fabric under his arms. The CEO of Precision Armory had sprinted down 4 flights of stairs from the executive offices, his leather shoes slipping on the polished steps, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might actually burst through his ribcage. He took in the scene with a single sweeping glance that missed nothing. Margaret at the ammunition counter, hands shaking but posture perfect. The destroyed packaging scattered across the counter. Brandon with his phone still pressed to his ear, mouth hanging open. Stephen standing frozen like someone had hit pause on his entire existence. In the crowd, dozens of people with their phones out, all of them about to witness something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Alexander's eyes locked onto Margaret's face, and something profound happened to his expression. Recognition crashed over him like a tidal wave, followed immediately by a tsunami of emotion so powerful that his knees actually buckled slightly. His hand shot out to grab the doorframe for support. "No," he whispered, then louder, his voice cracking. "It can't be. You're supposed to be." He couldn't finish the sentence. The words died in his throat as 28 years of memories flooded back all at once. A training facility in the mountains. Instructions delivered in a calm voice that never wavered, even when everything around them was chaos. A mission in Kosovo that had gone sideways, so fast nobody should have made it out alive. And a woman with steel blue eyes who'd somehow gotten all of them home anyway. Instructor Sullivan, Alexander said, and the title carried a weight that made every person in the store understand they'd missed something crucial. His voice shook with barely controlled emotion. "Is it really you?" Margaret's trembling hands remained at her sides, but something in her eyes softened just a fraction. "Hello, Alex. It's been a long time." Then Alexander Chun, CEO of the 3rd largest firearms retail chain in North America, a man who commanded boardrooms and negotiated multi-million-dollar contracts without breaking a sweat, did something nobody in that store would ever forget. He dropped to one knee right there in the entrance, his expensive suit jacket touching the floor, his head bowed like he was in the presence of royalty. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice carried absolute reverence. "Cadet Chun, Advanced Course, Class Delta 96. You saved my career. You saved my life. Kosovo, 2001. I've never forgotten." The store erupted into chaos. Not the mocking kind from earlier, but shocked chaos, the kind that happens when reality shifts so dramatically that people's brains can't quite process what they're seeing. Phones that had lowered came back up at lightning speed. Trembling hands trying to capture footage while also trying to wipe away sudden tears. Brandon's call to corporate headquarters forgotten as his phone hung loose in his suddenly nerveless fingers. The woman in designer jeans had gone completely white, her carefully applied makeup starting to run as tears streamed down her face. She looked like she might actually be sick. The man in the expensive hunting jacket had both hands over his mouth, his eyes wide with horror at what he'd said, what he'd done, what he'd been part of. But Alexander wasn't done. He remained on one knee, and now his eyes swept across the room with the kind of authority that had built a business empire from nothing. When he spoke again, his words were precise and deliberate, making sure every single person understood the magnitude of their mistake. "This woman," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the store, "is Master Instructor Margaret Sullivan. In military circles where people still remember what honor means, she's known as the Gray Ghost. She served as Master Instructor at the Advanced Marksmanship Training Center for 28 years. He paused, letting that information sink in, watching faces pale and hands start to shake. She didn't just train soldiers. She trained the instructors who trained soldiers. She wrote the classified manuals that Special Forces units still study today. She developed techniques that are now standard operating procedure for counterterrorism units in 14 different countries. Thomas Harrison had moved closer without realizing it, drawn by Alexander's words like a moth to flame. His own military training had his body standing at attention even though nobody had given an order. He'd heard stories about the Gray Ghost during his time in service. Everyone had. Whispered tales and secure facilities about an instructor who could shoot the wings off a fly at impossible distances, who trained more elite marksmen than any other person in modern military history. But those stories had always seemed like legends, the kind of tales that got exaggerated with each telling. Standing here looking at a gray-haired woman with trembling hands and comfortable shoes, Thomas was having trouble reconciling the legend with reality. Then again, maybe that was the point. Maybe the most dangerous people were the ones who looked the least dangerous. Alexander's voice continued, and now there was an edge to it, anger barely held in check. The tremor you all found so amusing? That permanent neurological damage was sustained during an extraction operation in Bosnia, 2001. For soldiers trapped in an ambush, surrounded by enemy fire, no air support available, no reinforcements coming. He paused, his jaw clenching. Instructor Sullivan went in alone. She maintained defensive positions for 53 minutes with a compromised weapon and a compound fracture in her left arm. She carried out 2 wounded soldiers herself while providing covering fire with her offhand. Every single one of those 4 soldiers survived because she refused to leave them behind. The silence in the store was so absolute that people could hear their own heartbeats pounding in their ears. Someone near the back made a choking sound that might have been a sob. Brandon had lowered his phone completely, his face cycling through expressions so fast it was almost comical. Confusion, disbelief, dawning horror, and finally a sick realization that he'd just destroyed his own career in the most spectacular way possible. The corporate headquarters person on the other end of his call was still talking, asking for details, trying to understand the situation, but Brandon wasn't listening anymore. Stephen had retrieved something from behind the counter, moving with the kind of careful reverence usually reserved for holy relics. It was a framed photograph, old and slightly faded, but preserved behind glass. He held it up so everyone could see. The image showed a formal military ceremony from the late 1990s. Rows of soldiers in dress uniforms, flags and banners. And in the front row, standing at attention with a chest full of medals, was a younger version of Margaret. Her hair wasn't gray yet, and her hands weren't shaking, but those steel blue eyes were unmistakable. The caption below the photograph read, "Master Instructor M. Sullivan receiving Presidential Citation for Training Excellence and Valor, 1997. "That's impossible," someone in the crowd whispered, but the words carried no conviction. Everything about this situation was impossible, yet here it was happening anyway. Alexander finally stood up, his knees protesting the movement, and turned to face Brandon directly. What happened next would be replayed millions of times across social media, analyzed and discussed, and debated in comment sections and forums for years to come. "You're fired," Alexander said, and each word landed like a hammer blow. "Effective immediately. You'll clear out your locker, collect your personal belongings, and security will escort you from the premises. You are never to set foot in any Precision Armory location again." Brandon's mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. But Mr. Chun, I didn't know. How could I have known? She just looked like what?" Alexander's voice could have cut through steel. "Like an older woman? Like someone whose hands shake? Like someone who didn't fit your narrow definition of what a customer should look like." He stepped closer to Brandon, and despite the difference in their ages, Brandon unconsciously took a step backward. "You had dozens of chances to show basic human decency. You chose cruelty instead. You chose mockery. You chose to make someone feel small because it made you feel big. That's not a mistake, Brandon. That's a choice. And choices have consequences." The woman in designer jeans was openly crying now, her live stream still running but forgotten in her hand. Her followers were tearing her apart in the comments. People who actually knew about military service calling her out, demanding she apologize, threatening to report her to her employer. The carefully curated image she'd spent years building was crumbling in real time, destroyed by her own words captured on her own recording. Margaret had been quiet through all of this, letting events unfold around her like water flowing around a rock. But now she raised one trembling hand, and somehow that small gesture commanded more attention than all of Alexander's authority. "Alex," she said softly, "perhaps we should discuss this more privately?" But Alexander shook his head, his expression firm. "No, ma'am. With respect, no. What happened here happened publicly. What he did to you, he did in front of witnesses who recorded every word. The consequences need to be equally public." He turned back to the crowd, his voice carrying absolute authority. "Let me make something perfectly clear to everyone here. This company, every store we operate, every employee we hire, exists because of the service and sacrifice of people like Instructor Sullivan. People who gave everything so that we could stand here safely and argue about ammunition specifications." His voice grew harder, colder. "If you came here today and participated in mocking her, if you laughed along, if you recorded video hoping it would go viral for all the wrong reasons, then you need to take a long, hard look at who you are and who you want to be. Because right now, you should be ashamed." The woman in designer jeans made a sound like a wounded animal and turned to leave, pushing through the crowd toward the exit. But she stopped when Margaret spoke. "Wait," Margaret said, her trembling hand still raised. "Don't run away. That's not how you fix mistakes." The woman turned back, mascara running down her face in dark streaks, her perfect makeup ruined by tears and shame. "I'm so sorry," she choked out. "I'm so sorry. I said terrible things. I judged you. I made fun of you for my followers. I don't even know how to begin to apologize for that." Margaret studied her for a long moment, those steel blue eyes seeing through layers of makeup and designer clothes to something underneath. "What's your name?" "C. Cassidy. Cassidy Morrison." "Well, Cassidy Morrison, do you understand why what you did was wrong? Really understand? Not just feel bad because you got caught?" Cassidy nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "I made assumptions based on how you looked. I didn't see you as a person with a story and experience and dignity. I saw someone I thought I was better than. And I'm not. I'm really not." "That's a start," Margaret said gently. "The question is what you do with that understanding. Do you let it destroy you? Or do you let it reshape you into someone better?" Thomas Harrison had been standing silently through all of this, but now he found his voice. "Ma'am, I served 2 tours in Afghanistan with the 75th Ranger Regiment. If I'd been paying attention, really looking, I would have seen the signs. Your stance, the way you assess a room, the specific pattern of your tremor. I should have known. I should have said something." Margaret turned to him, and something in her expression softened slightly. "You're Thomas Harrison's son, aren't you? I trained your father in '94. He was one of the best students I ever taught." Thomas's eyes went wide. "You knew my dad? He saved 3 lives in Mogadishu using techniques I taught him. Every instructor remembers the students who make a difference." She paused, her trembling hands clasping in front of her. "How is he?" Thomas's face fell. "He passed away 2 years ago. Cancer." "I'm sorry," Margaret said, and the simple words carried genuine grief. "He was a good man and a good soldier. You should be proud." "I am," Thomas said, his voice thick. "And I'm ashamed that I stood here and let this happen without speaking up." The moment stretched out, heavy with emotion and unspoken words. Brandon still stood near the counter, his face a mask of shock and growing horror as the full weight of his actions settled onto his shoulders. His career was over, his reputation destroyed, all because he'd seen an older woman with shaking hands and assumed she was weak, confused, less than. Stephen had moved to stand beside Alexander, and now he cleared his throat. "Sir, there's something else. Something you need to know about." Alexander turned to him, one eyebrow raised in question. 3 weeks ago, we had a break-in. Someone bypassed our security system and accessed our classified inventory files, the ones we keep for law enforcement and military contracts. We thought it was corporate espionage, maybe a competitor trying to steal our supplier contacts. Stephen pulled out his tablet and brought up security footage. But our facial recognition system just flagged something. The person who broke in 3 weeks ago is in this store right now. The crowd shifted nervously, everyone suddenly suspicious of the people around them. Alexander's expression hardened, his hand moving unconsciously toward his phone, ready to call security or police or whoever needed to be called. "Who?" he demanded. Stephen turned the tablet around, showing frozen security footage. The image was grainy but clear enough. A young man, maybe early 20s, wearing a dark hoodie and gloves, his face partially visible as he worked on bypassing the alarm system. Then Stephen pulled up another image, this one from the store's security cameras from today. The same young man, no hoodie this time, standing in the crowd that had gathered to mock Margaret. His face pale, his eyes wide, watching everything unfold. Thomas followed Stephen's gaze and felt his stomach drop. Tyler Morrison. He's been coming into the store for weeks, always asking questions about military ammunition, always wanted to know about classified contracts and special operations equipment. Tyler, standing near the back of the crowd, realized everyone was looking at him. His face went from pale to white, all blood draining away like someone had opened a valve. He took a step backward, then another, clearly considering running. "Don't," Margaret said, her voice quiet but carrying absolute authority. "Running just makes everything worse." Tyler froze, caught between the instinct to flee and the command in her voice. His hands were shaking now too, though for entirely different reasons than Margaret's tremor. I can explain," he stammered, his voice breaking. "It's not what you think. I wasn't trying to steal anything or sell information. I just needed to know." "Know what?" Alexander demanded, his patience clearly running thin. Tyler's eyes filled with tears. "My brother. My older brother David. He died 4 years ago in Syria. Special operations, classified mission. They sent us a folded flag and a form letter. That's it. No details, no explanation, nothing about who he was or what he did or why it mattered." His voice broke completely now, words tumbling out between sobs. "I just wanted to understand. The official records are so empty, so redacted. Just black lines where his service should be. I want to know who my brother was, what he did, why his life mattered. So I broke in. I accessed the classified files. And I found ammunition requisition orders with his unit designation. I thought maybe if I understood the missions, the equipment they used, I could piece together his story." Margaret's expression shifted, the steel in her eyes softening into something that looked almost like pain. "What was your brother's name?" "His full name. David Morrison. Sergeant David Morrison, 5th Special Forces Group." Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them again, they held memories that cut like broken glass. "I knew your brother. I trained him in advanced marksmanship in 2012. He was exceptional. Natural talent combined with dedication you rarely see." Tyler's legs gave out. He sank to the floor right there in the middle of Precision Armory, surrounded by strangers who'd been laughing minutes ago and were now witnessing something raw and private and profound. "You knew him?" Tyler's voice was barely a whisper. "You actually knew David? He saved 5 civilians during an extraction operation in Aleppo." Margaret continued, her trembling hands clasped in front of her like she was praying. "Used techniques I taught him to provide covering fire while his team got innocent people out of a building that was about to collapse. The operation isn't in any official record because it was conducted without authorization. Your brother saw people who needed help and decided to help them regardless of orders or consequences." She moved closer to Tyler, her worn shoes silent on the polished floor. "He was a hero, not because he followed rules, but because he knew when rules mattered less than lives. The official record might be empty, but I remember him. I remember all of them." Alexander had been watching this exchange with an expression that mixed anger at the break-in with sympathy for the reason behind it. "Stephen, what information did he actually access?" Stephen checked his tablet, scrolling through security logs. Ammunition requisition orders, equipment manifests, training records. Nothing that would compromise ongoing operations or put anyone at risk. Just historical data about units and deployments. He was looking for his brother's story. Margaret said quietly. Not secrets to sell, not information to weaponize, just answers that nobody would give him. Alexander ran a hand through his hair, messing it up even more than his sprint down the stairs had already done. This is still a federal crime. Breaking into secure databases, accessing classified information without authorization. I have to report this. I know, Tyler said, his voice steadier now, even though tears still ran down his face. I knew when I did it that I could go to prison. I just didn't care. For years of not knowing, of wondering, of having this hole where my brother should be. It was worth the risk. Margaret turned to Alexander, and something in her posture suggested she was about to make a request that she knew he might not be able to grant. Alex, I understand the legal implications. But this boy didn't steal military secrets. He stole grief. He stole the right to know his own brother's story. And that's a theft the system committed first. Ma'am, with all respect, I can't just ignore. I'm not asking you to ignore it, Margaret interrupted. I'm asking you to let me handle it. Tyler broke rules to access information about my former students. Let me be the one to decide what happens next. Alexander looked at her for a long moment, clearly torn between duty and respect, between what the rules demanded and what his conscience suggested. Finally, he nodded slowly. The break-in will need to be documented officially. But given the circumstances and the nature of what was accessed, I think we can avoid pressing charges. On the condition that Tyler here agrees to community service and counseling. Tyler looked up from the floor, hope flickering across his face like a candle in the wind. Really? You do that? I'm not doing it, Alexander said. Instructor Sullivan is. I'm just agreeing to her judgment. But Tyler, you need to understand something. Your brother's service matters. His sacrifice matters. And dishonoring his memory by breaking the law doesn't honor him. It diminishes what he stood for. I know, Tyler whispered. I know that now. Margaret reached down with a trembling hand and helped Tyler to his feet. Despite her shaking, despite her age, there was strength in that grip that spoke of years lifting weapons and wounded soldiers and the weight of responsibility. There's a veterans support organization downtown, she said. They help families of fallen soldiers navigate the bureaucracy, file the right forms, access the information they're legally entitled to. I'll make some calls. We'll get you your brother's story the right way. She paused, her steel blue eyes holding his. But more than that, I'll tell you about him myself. The things that aren't in any official record. The jokes he told, the way he helped younger soldiers, the time he stayed up all night with a trainee who was struggling because he refused to let anyone fail on his watch. Those are the stories that matter. Those are the brother you need to know. Tyler broke down completely then, sobbing with the kind of grief that had been locked up for 4 years, finally given permission to escape. Margaret pulled him into a hug, her trembling arms wrapping around this young man who'd broken the law just to know his brother was more than a folded flag and a form letter. The store had gone quiet again, but this time it wasn't the silence of shock or shame. It was the silence of people witnessing something sacred, something private being shared in public, because sometimes that's where healing happens. Cassidy, the woman who'd been live streaming, had stopped recording finally, but she hadn't left. She stood near the entrance, watching Margaret comfort Tyler, and something in her expression suggested she was learning lessons that would take years to fully understand. Brandon had finished clearing out his locker. Security stood nearby, waiting to escort him out, but he paused at the entrance. He looked at Margaret, opened his mouth to say something, then closed it again. What could he possibly say that would matter? That would undo the damage? That would take back the cruelty? Margaret saw him standing there and released Tyler from the hug. She walked toward Brandon, her trembling gait steady despite the shaking, and stopped a few feet away. You made a mistake today, she said quietly. A big one. The question is what you do with it. Do you let it make you bitter and defensive? Or do you let it teach you something about humility and respect? Brandon's voice came out hoarse and broken. How do I fix this? Everyone's seen what I did. My career is over. My reputation destroyed. How do I come back from this? Maybe you don't come back, Margaret said. Maybe you go forward instead. Forward into being someone different. Someone better. Someone who sees people instead of categories. She reached into her purse, and pulled out a business card, worn and bent at the corners. This is the same veterans organization I just told Tyler about. They need volunteers, people who understand what it's like to be humbled, to realize how little you actually know about others. Go there. Help. Learn. Become someone your future self can be proud of. Brandon took the card with shaking hands, staring at it like it might disappear if he blinked. Why would you help me? After what I did? Because someone helped me once, Margaret said simply, when I was young and stupid and thought I knew everything. An older instructor showed me grace I didn't deserve, and it saved my life. Maybe I'm just paying that forward. Security escorted Brandon out, and the crowd began to disperse slowly, reluctantly, like people leaving a concert they wished could last forever. Many of them stopped to apologize to Margaret, mumbled words of shame and regret that she accepted with quiet dignity. Alexander stood beside Stephen, watching it all unfold, and shook his head in amazement. 28 years since I last saw her, and she's still teaching, still showing people who they could be instead of condemning them for who they are. Sir, Stephen said carefully, what about the media coverage? This is going to be everywhere. Videos, news stories, social media posts. By tomorrow, everyone will know what happened here. Alexander thought about it for a moment, then smiled grimly. Good. Let's spread. Let everyone see what happens when you judge people by their appearance. Let them see what grace looks like when someone has every right to destroy you, but chooses mercy instead. He pulled out his phone and started making calls. Not to lawyers or PR firms, but to veterans organizations, military charities, groups that supported wounded warriors and their families. By the time the sun set, Precision Armory would announce a new initiative. A scholarship program for family members of fallen soldiers. A training center for disabled veterans who wanted to learn adaptive marksmanship techniques. And a company-wide policy that discrimination based on age, appearance, or disability would result in immediate termination. Margaret had finished gathering her things, her trembling hands carefully placing items back into her small purse. She picked up the ammunition she'd originally come to purchase, the box that Brandon had mocked her for wanting. Alexander walked over to her, and this time his expression was purely professional. Ma'am, that ammunition is complimentary. On the house, along with anything else you might need. And I'd like to offer you a consulting position. We're developing a new training program for our staff, teaching them about the customers we serve, the sacrifices people have made. I can't think of anyone better qualified to lead that program. Margaret considered it for a moment, her steel blue eyes studying him with the same intensity she'd once used to evaluate trainees. I'll think about it, Alex. But right now, I have someone waiting for me. She walked toward the exit, her gait steady despite the trembling, her posture perfect despite the years. Thomas Harrison stepped forward as she passed, coming to attention without thinking about it, his body responding to decades of training. Ma'am, it was an honor, he said. Your father would be proud of you, Margaret replied. You spoke up when it mattered. That's what he taught you, and that's what I taught him. Outside, the late afternoon sun painted everything in shades of gold and amber. Margaret stood on the sidewalk for a moment, breathing in the cool air, letting the tension of the past hour drain away. Her hands still shook. They would always shake, but that was okay. She learned long ago that strength didn't mean not shaking. It meant shaking and still moving forward anyway. A car pulled up to the curb, older model sedan with a veteran's bumper sticker. The driver's window rolled down, revealing a woman in her 70s with white hair and kind eyes. How'd it go? The woman asked. Margaret smiled, a real smile this time, warm and genuine. About like we expected, Helen. They saw an old woman with shaky hands and assumed I was lost. Helen laughed. And then they learned that assumptions are dangerous things. Margaret climbed into the passenger seat, setting her ammunition carefully on the floor. As Helen pulled away from the curb, Margaret glanced back at Precision Armory one last time. Through the windows, she could see people still gathered inside, still processing what had happened, still learning lessons that would probably take them years to fully understand. You know, Helen said as they merged into traffic, you could have just told them who you were from the start. Saved yourself all that humiliation. I could have, Margaret agreed. But then they wouldn't have learned anything. Sometimes people need to see their own prejudices reflected back at them before they can recognize them. Always the instructor, Helen said with affection. Always, Margaret confirmed. As they drove through the city, past shops and restaurants, and ordinary people living ordinary lives, Margaret thought about the young man named Tyler who'd broken the law just to know his brother's story. About Brandon who destroyed his career with cruelty but might rebuild something better from the ruins. About Cassidy who'd weaponized her social media presence for mockery and might now use it for something more meaningful. Her hands trembled in her lap, constant and unceasing, a permanent reminder of a day in Bosnia when she'd refused to leave soldiers behind. The nerve damage was irreversible. The doctors had told her she'd never shoot again, never hold a weapon steady, never return to the work that defined her. They'd been wrong. She'd adapted, learned to work with the tremor instead of against it, turned a disability into just another variable to account for. And in doing so, she taught thousands of students that limitations were only as permanent as you allowed them to be. Helen turned on the radio, and soft jazz filled the car. They drove in comfortable silence, two old friends who'd known each other long enough that words weren't always necessary. Behind them, Precision Armory was already dealing with the aftermath of what had happened. Phone calls to corporate headquarters, meetings about policy changes, discussions about training programs, and sensitivity initiatives. But that was their problem to solve. Margaret had done what she came to do. She bought ammunition, taught some lessons, and shown people that the most dangerous person in any room was often the one who looked the least threatening. The gray-haired woman, with trembling hands who they'd mocked and dismissed, had turned out to be a legend they'd only heard whispered about in secure facilities. Tomorrow, the videos would spread across the internet. Millions of people would watch Alexander Chun drop to one knee, would hear him explain who Margaret Sullivan really was, would witness the transformation from mockery to reverence in real time. Some would say it was staged. Others would call it propaganda. But veterans would know the truth. They always did. And in living rooms and barracks and veterans' halls across the country, old soldiers would see that footage and smile. Because they'd known all along. The gray ghost was real. The legends were true. And the most important lessons were always taught by people you'd underestimate if you weren't paying attention. Margaret's hands trembled in her lap as Helen drove them home through the fading light. But she didn't try to still them or hide them or wish them away. They were part of her story now, permanent markers of a day when she'd refused to let good people die on her watch. And if that meant spending the rest of her life with hands that shook, well, that was a price she'd paid gladly. Because some things were worth shaking for. Some people were worth saving. And some lessons could only be taught by those who'd lived through what they were teaching. Margaret Sullivan, master instructor, the Gray Ghost, had spent 28 years teaching those lessons. And apparently, even in retirement, she wasn't quite done yet.